The bright morning sun cast long shadows across the private aviation terminal as Dr. Sarah Thompson pulled up in her Tesla Model X. Her dark blue pantsuit was crisp and professional, perfectly pressed for the medical conference she was scheduled to speak at in 3 hours. She checked her watch, 7:30 a.m., exactly 2 hours before her flight. Sarah had earned her success the hard way. Growing up in a middle-class family in Detroit, she had worked multiple jobs to put herself through medical school, eventually becoming one of the country's top neurosurgeons. Now, at 38, she owned a successful medical transport company alongside her thriving surgical practice. The click of her heels echoed through the parking lot as she walked toward the terminal entrance. Her carry-on bag rolled smoothly behind her, containing her laptop and the presentation she would be delivering to 500 medical professionals in Chicago. The conference organizers had specifically requested her presence as the keynote speaker to discuss her groundbreaking surgical techniques. As she approached the terminal's glass doors, Sarah noticed her reflection and quickly adjusted her pearl necklace, a graduation gift from her late grandmother. She smiled, remembering how proud her grandmother had been when she finished medical school at the top of her class. The pearls were her lucky charm, worn during every important presentation or surgery. Inside the terminal, the atmosphere was different from regular commercial airports. The private aviation area was quiet, exclusive, and typically efficient. The marble floors gleamed under soft lighting, and comfortable leather chairs dotted the waiting area. A few other travelers, mostly business executives, sat checking their phones or laptops. Sarah pulled out her folder containing her flight documentation. Everything was in order, just as her assistant had confirmed yesterday. The charter company had sent multiple confirmations, and she had triple-checked all the details. Being methodical was second nature to her, both in the operating room and in her business dealings. Walking towards the security checkpoint, she noticed the guard, Michael Wells, watching her with an intensity that seemed unusual. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair at his temples and a stern expression that deepened as she got closer. Sarah had grown accustomed to these looks throughout her career, but had learned to handle them with grace and professionalism. As she reached for her ID, Sarah mentally reviewed her schedule for the day. After landing in Chicago at 10:45 a.m., she would have time for a quick lunch before her 1:00 p.m. keynote speech. The conference organizers had also arranged dinner with several prominent neurologists to discuss potential collaborations. "Good morning," Sarah said pleasantly, extending her ID and flight documents. She noticed that the businessman who had just passed through before her hadn't been asked to show anything beyond a quick flash of his ID. Wells barely glanced at her documents before his face hardened. "I'm going to need to see additional identification," he said, his tone carrying an edge that made several nearby passengers look up from their phones. Sarah maintained her composure, though she felt her heart rate quicken slightly. She had encountered similar situations before, but it never got easier. With steady hands, she reached into her briefcase and pulled out her medical license, hospital ID, and passport. "I have a flight scheduled for 9:30 a.m. to Chicago," she explained calmly. "I'm the keynote speaker at the International Neurosurgery Conference this afternoon." Her voice was clear and professional, carrying across the quiet terminal. Wells picked up each piece of identification, examining them with exaggerated scrutiny. Meanwhile, two more passengers, both white executives, walked through the checkpoint with barely a glance from the other security personnel. The tension in the air grew thicker as Wells continued his unnecessary inspection. Sarah noticed a young woman at the coffee counter watching the scene unfold, her expression a mix of concern and embarrassment. Even the receptionist behind the counter had stopped typing, her fingers hovering over her keyboard as she observed the situation. Sarah stood perfectly still, her posture straight and dignified. Years of performing delicate surgeries under pressure had taught her the value of remaining calm in challenging situations. She watched as Wells repeatedly looked between her face and her identification photos, his actions becoming increasingly awkward as the minutes ticked by. Little did Wells know that this morning would mark the beginning of a significant change in both their lives, though not in the way either of them could have expected. The events about to unfold would ripple through the private aviation industry and beyond, challenging long-held biases and transforming policies across the country. The situation at the security checkpoint continued to grow more tense as Wells held on to Dr. Thompson's documents. His face showed a mix of stubborn determination and increasing discomfort as he realized other people were watching. The terminal had grown quieter, with several passengers now openly staring at the scene. "These seem irregular," Wells said, though he couldn't point out anything actually wrong with the perfectly valid IDs. He shifted his weight from one foot to another, his uniform badge catching the morning light. "I'll need to call my supervisor for verification." Sarah noticed how his hands shook slightly as he reached for his radio. She had seen this behavior before. People trying to justify their prejudices when confronted with evidence that challenged their assumptions. Through the glass walls of the terminal, she could see her chartered jet waiting on the tarmac, its pristine white surface gleaming in the morning sun. "Sir," Sarah said, her voice carrying the same calm authority she used in the operating room, "I provided 5 different forms of identification, including my medical license and passport. Other passengers have passed through with just a driver's license. Could you explain what seems irregular?" Wells's face reddened. A drop of sweat appeared on his forehead despite the terminal's cool air conditioning. He fumbled with the radio, almost dropping it. "Protocol," he muttered, though he couldn't meet her eyes. "We have strict protocols." Just then, a group of medical equipment transporters walked past, pushing carts loaded with specialized containers. Sarah recognized them as employees from her company, the same company that owned the jet she was about to board. The workers nodded respectfully to her, calling out, "Good morning, Dr. Thompson." Wells's eyes widened slightly at this interaction, but he doubled down. "I still need supervisor approval," he insisted, his voice growing louder as if volume could make up for his increasingly shaky position. The radio in his hand crackled with static as he finally managed to call for backup. Sarah glanced at her watch, 7:45 a.m. She had planned to review her presentation one final time before takeoff, but this delay was eating into her carefully scheduled morning. Still, she maintained her professional demeanor, drawing on years of experience dealing with difficult situations. A young flight attendant who had been arranging magazines in the waiting area approached the checkpoint. She looked nervously between Sarah and Wells, clearly recognizing the situation for what it was. "Mr. Wells?" she said softly. "That's Dr. Thompson. She's one of our most frequent flyers." Wells ignored the flight attendant, pretending to study Sarah's documents even more closely. His hands were now visibly shaking, and he had started to perspire more heavily. The collar of his uniform shirt had dark spots forming around the neck. Other security guards at nearby posts were exchanging uncomfortable glances. One of them, a younger woman, seemed to be texting someone urgently on her phone. The terminal's regular sounds, the hum of air conditioning, distant airplane engines, quiet conversations, seemed to fade into the background as the tension mounted. Sarah stood perfectly still, her expression neutral but dignified. She thought about all the young medical students she mentored, especially those from minority backgrounds. She had always taught them to handle discrimination with grace while standing firm in their rights. Now, she was living those lessons in real time. "Is there a problem here?" A strong, confident voice suddenly called out. Captain James Rodriguez, the pilot scheduled to fly Sarah's charter, strode purposefully toward the checkpoint. His captain's uniform was immaculate, his bearing professional and authoritative. Wells jumped slightly at the new voice, almost dropping Sarah's documents. "I'm just following protocol," he stammered, but his voice had lost its earlier assertiveness. He could feel his position crumbling, especially as he noticed more people gathering around the scene. The captain's expression was stern as he approached. He had flown Dr. Thompson on several occasions and knew exactly who she was. More importantly, he recognized the all-too-familiar situation unfolding before him. As Captain Rodriguez reached the checkpoint, Wells' radio suddenly crackled to life. A voice announced that the supervisor was on their way. The message seemed to echo through the now-silent terminal, where every eye was fixed on the unfolding drama at the security checkpoint. Captain Rodriguez stood next to Sarah, his presence adding another layer of authority to the situation. "Mr. Wells," he said firmly, "Dr. Thompson isn't just a passenger. She owns MedFlight Solutions, our largest medical transport division, the same company that owns this terminal." Wells's face, which had been red with stubbornness moments ago, suddenly turned pale. His hands, still clutching Sarah's documents, began to tremble more visibly. The security guard looked as if someone had just pulled the floor out from under his feet. The terminal had become so quiet that everyone could hear the distinct sound of heels clicking on marble as Linda Chen, the terminal supervisor, hurried toward the checkpoint. She was a sharp-dressed woman in her 50s who had worked in aviation for over 2 decades. One look at the scene, and she immediately understood the gravity of the situation. "Dr. Thompson," Linda said warmly, shooting a disapproving glance at Wells, "I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience. Please, let me escort you to your aircraft." She reached out to collect Sarah's documents from Wells's still-frozen hands. But Sarah raised her hand gently, stopping Linda. "Actually," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I'd like to discuss something important." The small crowd that had gathered held their breath, expecting an outburst or demand for Wells's immediate firing. Instead, Sarah turned to face Wells directly. "Mr. Wells, I'm going to be late for my conference if I don't board soon, but I'd like to schedule a meeting with terminal management this afternoon when I return." Her words carried no anger, only determination. Not to file a complaint, but to discuss implementing mandatory bias training for all security personnel. Wells blinked rapidly, confused by this unexpected response. He had been bracing himself for a very different outcome. Around them, people exchanged surprised looks, and Linda Chen's expression shifted from concern to interest. "I believe," Sarah continued, addressing both Linda and Captain Rodriguez, "that this is an opportunity for positive change. Firing someone doesn't solve the deeper issue. Education and understanding do." She spoke with the same thoughtful precision she used when explaining complex surgical procedures to her students. Captain Rodriguez nodded approvingly. He had seen many similar incidents end in anger and termination, only for the same problems to surface again with different personnel. This was the first time he'd witnessed someone try to transform such a situation into a learning opportunity. Linda Chen pulled out her tablet and quickly checked her calendar. "Dr. Thompson, I can arrange a video conference for 4:30 p.m. after your keynote speech. Would that work for you?" Her fingers were already typing out meeting invites. Sarah agreed, then turned back to Wells, who hadn't moved or spoken. His face showed a complex mix of emotions: shame, relief, and confusion. "Mr. Wells, I hope you'll join us for that meeting," she said. "Your perspective will be valuable in understanding how we can do better." Wells managed a small nod, finally finding his voice. "Yes, I'll be there," he mumbled, handing back her documents with trembling hands. The security guard looked like a man who had just been offered an unexpected lifeline instead of the punishment he'd been expecting. As Linda began escorting Sarah toward her waiting jet, the gathered crowd slowly dispersed, but the energy in the terminal had changed. Conversations in hushed tones broke out among the witnesses, many expressing amazement at how the situation had been handled. Captain Rodriguez stayed behind for a moment, looking at Wells. "That woman just saved your job and turned it into a teaching moment," he said quietly. "In 30 years of flying, I've never seen anyone handle discrimination with such grace and wisdom." Wells sat heavily in his security chair, looking shell-shocked. Through the terminal's large windows, he watched as Dr. Thompson walked toward her jet, her head held high, her steps confident and purposeful. The morning sun caught her pearl necklace, making it gleam briefly like a beacon of hope. The security guard didn't know it yet, but this morning's confrontation would mark the beginning of a significant change in his life, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about prejudice, privilege, and the power of education over punishment. On board the private jet, Sarah settled into the plush leather seat as Captain Rodriguez prepared for takeoff. The morning's events still lingered in her mind, but her thoughts were already turning to how she could use this incident to create meaningful change. Through the window, she could see Wells still sitting at his post, looking lost in thought. Linda Chen had already begun making calls, setting up the afternoon's meeting. Several other airport executives, having heard about the incident, had asked to join. What had started as a confrontation was quickly turning into an opportunity for institutional change. "Dr. Thompson," Captain Rodriguez called from the cockpit doorway. "We're cleared for takeoff, but there's something you should know." He walked down the aisle and showed her his phone. One of the passengers recorded the incident. It's already getting attention on social media. Sarah leaned forward to look at the screen. The video showed her calm response to Wells's discrimination, and the comments below were overwhelmingly supportive. Many praised her professional handling of the situation, while others shared similar experiences at various airports. I didn't want this to become a social media sensation, Sarah sighed, thinking about how the public attention might affect Wells and the upcoming meeting. This needs to be about positive change, not public shaming. As the jet took off, Sarah pulled out her laptop and began drafting an outline for the bias training program she envisioned. Her medical background had taught her that treatment was always more effective than punishment. The same principle, she believed, could apply to social issues. Meanwhile, back at the terminal, Wells sat at his post, barely noticing the passengers walking past. His phone had been buzzing nonstop. His supervisor, his wife, and even his daughter had seen the viral video. His daughter's message hit particularly hard. "Dad, how could you? You always taught me to judge people by their character." Linda Chen approached Wells's station, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to him and pulled up a chair. "Michael," she said, using his first name for the first time in their 5 years of working together, "tell me honestly, what were you thinking?" Wells stared into his coffee cup. I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've done this job for 12 years. Maybe I've been running on autopilot, following patterns I didn't even realize I had." Linda nodded, understanding but not excusing. "The meeting this afternoon isn't just about protocols and training," she said. "It's about acknowledging our biases and actively working to change them. Dr. Thompson is giving you a chance many wouldn't." As the morning progressed, the video continued to spread. Local news stations were calling the terminal, requesting interviews. Linda deflected them all, respecting Sarah's wish to keep the focus on education rather than publicity. In Chicago, Sarah's plane landed right on schedule. As she gathered her belongings, Captain Rodriguez handed her a piece of paper. "It's Wells's phone number," he explained. "He asked me to give it to you before we left. Said he'd understand if you didn't want to use it, but he wanted to apologize properly." Sarah tucked the number into her pocket. She had a keynote speech to deliver first, but she made a mental note to call Wells before the afternoon meeting. Sometimes she knew the most important conversations needed to happen one-on-one, away from the pressure of public scrutiny. As she stepped off the plane, her phone buzzed with a message from Linda. The afternoon meeting had grown, now including representatives from 3 other private aviation companies who wanted to implement similar training programs. What had started as one guard's bias was becoming a catalyst for industry-wide change. Sarah smiled as she walked across the Chicago tarmac. In her years as a surgeon, she had learned that healing took many forms. Sometimes it meant operating on a patient's brain, and sometimes it meant operating on society's prejudices. One person, one conversation, one moment of understanding at a time. The large conference hall in Chicago buzzed with excitement as Sarah finished her keynote speech about innovative neurosurgical techniques. As the audience of medical professionals gave her a standing ovation, her mind was already shifting to the upcoming video conference with the airport staff. During the lunch break, Sarah found a quiet corner in the conference center and pulled out Wells's phone number. She looked at it for a long moment before dialing. The phone rang 3 times before a hesitant voice answered. "Mr. Wells," Sarah said gently, "this is Dr. Thompson. I thought we should talk before the meeting." There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a shaky breath. "Dr. Thompson, I've been sitting here all morning, watching people walk past my checkpoint." Wells's voice cracked slightly. "For the first time, I'm really seeing how I treat people differently. My daughter won't even talk to me after seeing that video." Sarah listened patiently as Wells continued. "I've worked security for 12 years, thinking I was just being thorough. But today, watching the video of myself," he paused, gathering his thoughts. "I saw what everyone else saw, pure prejudice. And the way you handled it, you've had every right to be angry, to demand my job." "Anger doesn't solve problems, Mr. Wells," Sarah replied, checking her watch. The video conference would start in 30 minutes. "Change happens through understanding and education. Are you willing to be part of that change?" Wells's response was immediate. Yes, I am. My supervisor offered to let me take the day off, but I stayed. I needed to face this, to really see myself and my actions." His voice grew stronger, more determined. "I want to do better." As Sarah ended the call, her phone buzzed with a message from Linda Chen. The video conference had grown even larger, now including diversity officers from major airlines and security companies. What had started as a small terminal incident was sparking industry-wide discussions. Back at the terminal, Wells straightened his uniform and walked into the conference room. Linda Chen was already there, setting up the video equipment. On the screen, he could see various boxes appearing as people joined the virtual meeting. Airline executives, security chiefs, and training coordinators from across the country. Sarah's face appeared on the main screen right on time. She looked as composed as she had that morning, despite having just delivered a 2-hour keynote speech. The terminal's conference room was now packed with staff, all eyes focused on the screen. "Thank you all for joining us," Sarah began, her voice clear and purposeful. What happened this morning could have ended many ways. But instead of focusing on punishment, let's focus on prevention. How can we create meaningful change in our industry? Wells listened intently as Sarah outlined her vision for a comprehensive training program. She spoke about unconscious bias, systemic discrimination, and the importance of creating an inclusive environment in aviation security. But what caught everyone's attention was when she asked Wells to share his perspective. Standing up on shaky legs, Wells faced the camera. "This morning, I was the problem," he began honestly. "But Dr. Thompson showed me I could also be part of the solution." He shared his realizations from the day, his voice growing stronger as he spoke about the need for change. As Wells spoke, Sarah noticed other security personnel nodding in recognition. Some even took notes. The atmosphere in both the Chicago conference room and the terminal's meeting room had transformed from tense anticipation to engaged participation. Linda Chen presented statistics about passenger complaints and discrimination incidents. The numbers were sobering, but they helped everyone understand the scope of the problem. Sarah's approach, focusing on education rather than punishment, was beginning to look like a model for handling similar situations industry-wide. By the end of the meeting, 3 major airlines had committed to implementing new training programs. Wells had volunteered to be part of the training development team, sharing his experience as a cautionary tale and a story of potential transformation. 3 months after the incident, the private aviation terminal looked different. New posters about diversity and inclusion decorated the walls, and security personnel wore pins indicating they had completed their bias awareness training. At his usual post, Michael Wells stood straighter, his interactions with passengers noticeably more respectful and consistent. The morning started like any other until Wells spotted a familiar face entering the terminal. Dr. Sarah Thompson walked through the doors, carrying the same rolling bag she'd had 3 months ago. This time, however, she wasn't alone. Behind her walked a group of young medical students from diverse backgrounds, all part of her new mentorship program. Wells took a deep breath and smiled genuinely. "Good morning, Dr. Thompson," he said, his voice clear and professional. "Welcome back. May I see your ID, please?" He asked the same of each student, maintaining the same respectful tone with everyone. Sarah noticed the change immediately. It wasn't just in Wells's behavior. The entire atmosphere of the terminal felt different. The security staff worked with a new awareness, treating each passenger with equal respect regardless of their appearance. "Mr. Wells," Sarah said after her group had cleared security, "do you have a moment?" The students gathered nearby, curious about the interaction between their mentor and the security guard they'd heard so much about. Wells stepped away from his post, gesturing to his colleague to cover for him. "Dr. Thompson, I've been hoping you'd come through here again," he said. "These past 3 months, they've changed my life." He pulled out his wallet and showed her a photo of his daughter. "She's speaking to me again," he said with a slight crack in his voice. "After she saw the training videos we made, after she watched me really trying to change, she said she was proud of me." Sarah smiled warmly. The training videos Wells mentioned had become part of a nationwide program. Security staff across multiple airports now watched him share his story, explaining how unconscious bias had affected his behavior and what he learned from the experience. "The students with me today," Sarah gestured to the group, "are part of our new aviation medicine program. They'll be flying regularly through this terminal. I wanted them to see firsthand how one incident of discrimination turned into an opportunity for positive change." One of the students, a young black woman named Maya, stepped forward. "Mr. Wells, we studied your case in our medical ethics class," she said. "It's different, seeing you in person. You're not just a case study anymore." Wells nodded, understanding the impact of his actions reached far beyond that one morning. The training program he helped develop had been implemented at 12 major airports, with more joining every month. Security complaints had dropped by 40% across participating locations. Linda Chen approached the group, carrying a folder. Dr. Thompson, perfect timing, she said. I have the latest statistics from our training program. Would you like to share them with your students? As Linda opened the folder, she revealed charts showing the dramatic decrease in discrimination complaints. But more importantly, passenger satisfaction scores had improved across all demographics. The data proved that treating everyone with respect didn't compromise security. It enhanced it. Mr. Wells leads our weekly training sessions now, Linda added proudly. New guards learn from his experience, and veteran staff members say it's changed how they approach their work. Sarah checked her watch. They had a flight to catch, but before leaving, she turned to her students. Remember this, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had turned a negative experience into positive change. Sometimes the biggest impact we can have isn't in how we respond to discrimination, but in how we help others learn from it. Wells watched as the group headed toward their gate. 3 months ago, he had been a different person, running on autopilot and letting his biases control his actions. Now, he was helping to change the very system he had once been part of the problem in. As he returned to his post, Wells straightened his new pin, a small symbol indicating he was a certified bias awareness trainer. The morning sun caught its surface, making it shine briefly, much like the pearl necklace Dr. Thompson had worn that fateful day 3 months ago. 6 months after the incident, Sarah found herself sitting in a large auditorium at the National Aviation Security Conference in Washington, D.C. She was there to give the keynote speech, but this time it wasn't about neurosurgery. Instead, she would be talking about how one morning at a private terminal had sparked a nationwide change in aviation security. Michael Wells sat in the front row, wearing a new suit his daughter had helped him pick out. Next to him sat Linda Chen and representatives from 20 major airports. They had all come to hear about what the media was calling the Thompson Method, turning incidents of discrimination into opportunities for education and growth. As Sarah took the stage, she noticed how different Wells looked from that morning 6 months ago. Gone was the defensive, rigid security guard. In his place sat a man who had become an unexpected champion for change in the aviation industry. 6 months ago, Sarah began, her voice carrying through the packed auditorium. I faced discrimination at a security checkpoint. But instead of ending with anger or punishment, that incident became the beginning of something remarkable. She gestured to Wells in the audience. And much of the credit goes to one security guard who had the courage to acknowledge his mistakes and work to correct them. Wells sat straighter in his chair as Sarah shared their story. She talked about the viral video, but focused on what happened afterward, the training programs, the industry-wide changes, and most importantly, the human impact of their work. In the past 6 months, Sarah continued, pulling up a slide with statistics, airports using our training program have seen a 70% decrease in discrimination complaints. But more importantly, they've seen a 90% increase in positive feedback from passengers of all backgrounds. The audience listened intently as Wells joined Sarah on stage. It was his turn to speak, something that would have terrified him 6 months ago. Now, he stepped up to the microphone with confidence. I was the problem, he began, just as he had in that first video conference. But thanks to Dr. Thompson's approach, I became part of the solution. He shared how the experience had changed not just his work life, but his personal life as well. Wells talked about his daughter, who now helped him review and improve the training materials. He mentioned the security guards who initially resisted the training, but eventually became its strongest advocates. Each story showed how changing one person's perspective could create a ripple effect throughout an entire industry. During the question and answer session, a young security officer stood up. Dr. Thompson, she said, your approach goes against what many people want. They demand immediate punishment for discrimination. How do you justify choosing education instead? Sarah smiled, having expected this question. Punishment ends with one person, she explained. Education spreads to hundreds, even thousands. Mr. Wells has trained over 500 security personnel. If we had simply fired him, none of those officers would have learned from his experience. After the conference, Wells approached Sarah with tears in his eyes. He handed her an envelope. Inside was a letter from his daughter, thanking Sarah for not giving up on her father. The letter described how Wells had changed, how he now spoke up when he heard biased comments, how he had become an advocate for diversity in his community. "My daughter's studying psychology now," Wells said proudly. "She wants to help develop training programs like ours. She says you showed her that change is possible, no matter how deeply rooted the problem might be." Sarah watched as Wells was surrounded by conference attendees, all eager to implement the training program at their airports. The security guard who had once blocked her path was now helping to clear the way for others, turning his past mistakes into valuable lessons for the future. As the day ended, Sarah received a message from her medical students. They had successfully completed their first solo flights through various airports, and not one had faced discrimination. The message included a photo of Maya, the young black medical student, being greeted respectfully by security staff wearing the same bias awareness pins that Wells had helped design. 1 year after the incident, Sarah stood in the same private aviation terminal where it had all begun. The space had transformed completely. New signs welcomed passengers in multiple languages, and the security checkpoint had been redesigned to ensure fair and consistent treatment for everyone. Today was special. The terminal was hosting an award ceremony. The Department of Transportation had chosen this location to present its first annual Excellence in Aviation Security Award. The terminal's waiting area had been converted into a small ceremony space, with rows of chairs facing a podium. Michael Wells adjusted his tie nervously as he prepared to accept the award. His daughter, Jessica, sat in the front row beside her mother, both beaming with pride. Behind them sat security staff from airports across the country, all wearing the bias awareness pins that have become a symbol of positive change. 1 year ago, Sarah began her introduction speech. This terminal was just another place where discrimination went unchallenged. Today, it's a model for airports worldwide. She paused, looking around at the familiar faces. But this transformation isn't just about new policies or training programs. It's about people willing to learn and change. Linda Chen stepped forward with a thick folder. "In the past year," she announced, "over 2,000 security personnel have completed our training program. Discrimination complaints have dropped by 85% across participating airports. But the numbers don't tell the whole story." She gestured to a screen showing testimonials from passengers and security staff. Among them was Maya, now the successful resident doctor, describing how the changed atmosphere in airports had made her frequent travels easier and more dignified. When Wells took the podium to accept the award, he didn't look at his prepared speech. Instead, he spoke from the heart. "A year ago, I was the problem standing in Dr. Thompson's way," he said, his voice steady. "Today, I help clear the path for others. But the real award belongs to Dr. Thompson, who saw potential for change when others might have seen only prejudice." Sarah watched from her seat as Wells continued speaking. She thought about all the lives touched by their story: the security guards who learned to recognize their biases, the passengers who no longer faced discrimination, and the next generation represented by people like Maya and Jessica. After the ceremony, Wells's daughter approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," Jessica said, hugging her. "You didn't just change my dad's life, you changed our whole family. Dad's different now. He's the person I always knew he could be." The ceremony ended, but its impact continued. News crews interviewed Wells and Sarah about their story. Aviation industry leaders discussed implementing the training program internationally. What had started as one woman's response to discrimination had grown into a movement for change. As the crowd dispersed, Sarah noticed a small group of young security trainees listening intently as Wells shared his experience. His words were different now from the defensive mumbling of a year ago. He spoke with the wisdom of someone who had faced his own prejudices and overcome them. Linda Chen appeared at Sarah's side, holding a framed photo. It showed Sarah and Wells from that first morning, captured from the security camera. Beside it was a current photo of them training new security staff together. The contrast was striking, not just in Wells's stance and expression, but in the whole atmosphere the images conveyed. "We're hanging this in the training center," Linda explained, "to remind everyone that change is possible, one person at a time." As Sarah prepared to board her flight that evening, she paused at the security checkpoint. Wells stood at his usual post, but now he greeted each passenger with the same respectful professionalism, regardless of their appearance. Their eyes met briefly, sharing an understanding of how far they'd come. The sun was setting as Sarah's plane took off, casting long shadows across the terminal where their story had begun. But unlike the shadows of prejudice that had once darkened these halls, these shadows were already fading, making way for a brighter, more inclusive tomorrow in the world of aviation security. The end. Would you like me to explain any part of the story or discuss how each section contributed to the overall narrative?